Welcome back to the Psychology of Us. I'm Professor RJ Starr, and today we're diving into a question that, like it or not, informs every action you take, every thought you have, and every decision you make. Your why. Why do you do what you do? Why do you think the way you think? It's easy to assume that the answer is obvious. I just do, because I want to, because it makes sense. But is that really true? How often do you stop and examine the forces that move you? Are you acting out of genuine intention, or are you simply responding to invisible influences, habits formed long ago, social conditioning, expectations you've absorbed without even realizing it? The word motive comes from the Latin movere, meaning to move. What moves you? What compels you forward? What drives you to wake up in the morning, to dress the way you do, to say the things you say, to spend your time the way you do? Most of us never truly ask these questions. We assume that we are making choices. But what if our choices have already been made for us long before we even considered them? That's what we're going to explore today, the psychology of your why. Not just what you do, but the deeper, often unconscious reasons behind it. We'll examine motivation, habit, language, conditioning, and how your past continues to shape your present without your permission. And more importantly, how you can take back that permission, how you can reclaim your why as your own. So settle in, because this isn't just an academic discussion. This is about you, your life, your mind, and the extraordinary power you hold once you understand what truly moves you.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
The psychological origins of motivation. Let's start with the fundamentals. What drives human behavior? What compels you to make choices, to pursue goals, to speak, to act? Psychology gives us a useful framework to understand this. Motivation. Motivation exists on a spectrum. On one end, we have intrinsic motivation, and on the other, extrinsic motivation. This distinction, first introduced by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan in their self-determination theory, explains why we do what we do. Intrinsic motivation is when you do something purely because it aligns with who you are, because it's meaningful to you, because it gives you a sense of fulfillment, because it's woven into the fabric of your own identity. You read a book because you're fascinated by the subject. You write, you paint, you learn a new language because it feels right, because it is an extension of you. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is when your actions are driven by external rewards or pressures. You work late, not because you love your job, but because you fear disappointing your boss. You dress a certain way, not because it reflects your inner self, but because it's what's expected of you. Now here's the problem. Most of us assume we are making choices based on intrinsic motivation. I do this because I want to. But how much of what you want has been shaped by forces beyond your awareness? This is where we need to pause and examine the concept of movement, of being moved. Because if you never interrogate your why, you risk living a life dictated by obligations, pressures, and inherited expectations rather than by your own true desires. I want you to think about this in a very practical way. Imagine two people running a marathon. One is running because they love the challenge, the discipline, the rhythm of their feet hitting the pavement. The other is running because they told their friends they would, and they don't want to look like a failure. The action is the same, but the why is fundamentally different. One is propelled forward by something deep inside. The other is simply being pulled along by the expectations of others. Which one are you? There's a fascinating study on this from the world of work psychology. Researchers found that people who connected their jobs to a personal sense of meaning, who felt their work aligned with their deeper purpose, were more engaged, more productive, and far more resilient in the face of stress. Meanwhile, those whose motivation was primarily external, money, promotion, status, reported higher burnout and lower long-term satisfaction. And this doesn't just apply to work. The way you spend your time, the way you present yourself, the things you tell yourself are important. Are they reflections of your own why? Or are they borrowed motivations from someone else? For a long time, I thought I knew my why. When I was younger, I was drawn to the discipline of drill teams, precision, performance. I was captivated by the way movement could be transformed into something purposeful, something powerful. But I also remember moments when that passion was tested. When I faced criticism, when I felt the weight of others' expectations and judgments pressing in. Was I continuing because I wanted to, or because I had invested too much to turn back? That was a defining moment. Because until you ask that question, is this truly mine, you don't actually know. So let me ask you again, what moves you? What compels you forward? If the answer isn't clear, that's where our real work begins. The unconscious architect, how your past shapes your why. If you truly want to understand your why, you have to go further back to the moments that shaped you, before you were even aware they were doing so. Because whether you realize it or not, your past is still making choices for you. Sigmund Freud introduced the idea that much of human behavior is dictated by the unconscious, the hidden part of the mind where repressed experiences, childhood conditioning, and unresolved conflicts reside. Carl Jung later expanded on this, arguing that we spend much of our lives unconsciously acting out patterns that were imprinted on us long ago. Think about that for a moment. What if the things you believe about yourself, the things that drive you, aren't actually yours? What if they are echoes of someone else's expectations, or the residual of old fears? Take a simple example. A child who grows up hearing that success means having a high-status career. That message embeds itself into their psyche, long before they are old enough to question it. They may pursue a profession they don't truly enjoy, not because it aligns with who they are, but because they have been conditioned to equate success with external validation. And they might not realize that conditioning until they wake up one day, years later, feeling hollow, wondering why their achievements bring no real satisfaction. This is what happens when we mistake inherited values for personal ones. I can tell you of personal experience. I remember being a senior in high school and coming home and telling my mother and father and grandmother that I wanted to major in psychology. The first reaction by all of them was, "Don't do it, you can't make enough money. You will not be successful." That stuck with me. And here we are 50 years later, and it's still replaying in my subconscious mind. This is what happens when we mistake inherited values for personal ones. There's a well-documented psychological phenomenon called introjection, when we unconsciously absorb the beliefs, attitudes, and expectations of those around us without question. Parents, teachers, peers, society itself. Each of these voices leaves an imprint. And if we never examine those imprints, they become the silent architects of our choices. I want you to reflect on something for a moment. What is a core belief you hold about yourself? Maybe it's something like, I have to work twice as hard to be worthy. Or, if I don't achieve, I'll be a disappointment. Or even, I'm not the kind of person who takes risks. Now ask yourself, where did that belief come from? Not long ago, a study on decision-making asked participants to explain why they preferred one brand over another. The researchers found that many of the participants confidently gave rational explanations. But when their subconscious associations were analyzed, it became clear that most of their preferences were shaped by early exposure, habit, and unconscious biases, rather than actual reasoning. In other words, they thought they had chosen freely, but their choices had already been made for them. Let me give you an example of this. I used to watch my grandmother take a ham and cut off the ends of the ham and put it in the pan before baking it. Every time she prepared a ham, she would take the ham, cut off the ends, place it in the pan before she put it in the oven. My mother did the same thing. She would take the ham, she would cut off the ends of the ham, place the ham in the baking pan, and then put it in the oven. Finally, one day I asked them, Nana, why do you always cut off the ends of the ham? She thought about it for a while, and she said, well, I guess I'm doing it out of habit because the pan that I had when I was a young woman was too small for the hams that I would get. The same is true for many of the decisions we make about ourselves, our careers, our relationships, and our values. How much of what you believe is actually yours, and how much have you simply inherited? When I was younger, I developed an intense drive for discipline and structure. Things that gave me a sense of control in a world that often felt unpredictable. That discipline led me to excel in certain areas of my life. But for a long time, I never questioned why I valued it so deeply. It took me years to realize that part of my why came from an early need to prove something, to myself, to others. That need wasn't necessarily bad, but it wasn't entirely conscious either. It had been shaped long before I ever examined it. And that's the real challenge, unearthing the unconscious forces that continue to shape your why. Because until you do, you're not truly choosing, you're just following a script that was written for you long ago. So let me leave you with a question. What's one thing you do, one belief you hold, that you've never stopped to question? Start there. That's where the work begins. The power of language in defining your why. If you want to understand your why, pay attention to your words. Not just what you say to others, but what you say to yourself in that inner narrative. Because language is more than just a tool for communication. It is the framework through which we shape reality. In psychology, there's something called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, which suggests that the language we use influences the way we think and perceive the world. If you don't have a word for a concept, it becomes harder to think about that concept. And if you constantly use limiting language, you may unknowingly be limiting yourself. Consider the phrases you use when you describe yourself. I have to. I should. I always. I never. Each of these expressions reveals something about how you perceive your agency, your control over your own why. If you constantly say, I have to do this rather than I choose to do this, what does that say about your relationship to your actions? If you say, I never take risks rather than I have not taken risks in the past, are you describing a fact or reinforcing a belief that may not serve you? Language isn't just reflective, it's generative. It creates patterns in the brain, reinforcing ideas until they become the default setting of your mind. The word define comes from the Latin definire, meaning to set boundaries. The way you describe yourself, your motivations, your purpose, these things set the boundaries of your reality. If you define yourself in restrictive terms, your why will remain confined within those limits. If you expand the language you use about yourself, you expand what's possible for you. There's an interesting study on this from the world of behavioral psychology. Researchers found that when people frame their goals using identity-based language, saying, I am a runner instead of I am trying to run more, or I don't eat junk food instead of I'm trying to eat healthier, they were far more likely to stick with their behaviors. The words we use don't just describe us, they shape who we become. So what happens when the words we use aren't consciously chosen, but inherited? Think about the labels you've carried with you for years, the ones you were given by family, by society, by teachers, by past experiences. Maybe you were told you were the responsible one, or the troublemaker, or the smartass, or the one who always gets things done. or the one who always gets away with things. Maybe you've internalized words that were never truly yours, but have dictated the way you see yourself. I remember a moment early in my academic career when someone referred to me as a natural leader. It wasn't something I had ever consciously identified with. I had always seen myself as disciplined, focused, determined, but leader wasn't a word I had claimed for myself. And yet, the moment that label was placed on me, I began to see myself differently. I started to ask, what does that mean? Is that something I want to embody? Or is it something that has been assigned to me? That's the power of language, you see. It has the ability to reinforce our why or distort it. So take a moment to reflect. What words have shaped your identity? What labels have you carried, consciously or unconsciously? And most importantly, are they accurate? Are they yours? Because if you don't define your why, someone else will do it for you. The illusion of choice. Are we truly the anchors of our why? We like to believe we are in control of our choices, that our why is entirely our own, but psychology suggests otherwise. Consider the concept of behaviorism, pioneered by B.F. Skinner. He argued that much of what we consider free will is actually conditioned behavior, shaped by reinforcement and external rewards. We act in ways that have been reinforced, and we avoid behaviors that have led to negative outcomes. In other words, many of our so-called choices are simply learned responses. Now, if this were entirely true, it would suggest that we are nothing more than products of conditioning, automatons responding to stimuli without real agency. But that's not quite the full picture. There's another psychological principle at play here, cognitive dissonance, a term coined by Leon Festinger. This occurs when our actions contradict our beliefs, creating internal discomfort. When we feel this tension, we either change our behavior or we rewrite our internal narrative to justify our actions. Here's how this plays out in real life. Let's say someone considers themselves a generous person, but they find themselves avoiding a friend in need. Instead of admitting, I acted selfishly, they may unconsciously shift their belief. That friend always takes advantage of me. The mind is remarkably skilled at adjusting our why after the fact in order to maintain a sense of consistency. So what does this mean for your motivations? It means that not only are you influenced by external conditioning, but you are also constantly reinterpreting your own choices to make them seem rational, even when they aren't entirely intentional. This is why so many of us go through life believing we are making independent decisions, when in reality our why is often dictated by invisible forces, habit, social pressure, cognitive bias. Think about consumer behavior. Studies have shown that people often justify purchases after they've made them. A person might buy an expensive watch and tell themselves it's for the quality craftsmanship, when the real reason might be status signaling or social conformity. They may not even be aware of the deeper psychological forces at play. So here's the question. How do you know if your why is truly yours? A useful exercise to follow your choice is to follow your choices backward. If you make a major decision, pause and ask yourself, what led me here? If the answer traces back to fear, obligation, or a vague sense of social expectation, then the why may not entirely be your own. But if you can track it to an internal conviction, a deep sense of meaning that exists regardless of outside validation, then you're likely moving from a place of genuine autonomy. And that's the key distinction. Are you reacting or are you choosing? I'll share a personal reflection on this. Earlier in my career, I pursued certain professional opportunities because they seemed like the right move. And I put right in quotation marks there. They seemed like the right move. But over time, I realized that some of those choices weren't driven by my own curiosity or passion. They were shaped by what I thought was expected of me. It wasn't until I stepped back and truly examined my motivations that I started making decisions that aligned with who I actually am rather than who I was trying to be. So I'll leave you with this. If you don't question your why, you may spend your life chasing things that were never truly meant for you. But the moment you start interrogating your motivations, you reclaim something powerful: agency, clarity, and the ability to move through life on your own terms. And isn't that the point? Reclaiming your why, the path to true agency. Now that we've explored your why, how your why is shaped by unconscious influences, by language, by external conditioning, the real question is, what do you do with this knowledge? How do you reclaim your why and ensure that it's truly your own? And then also, how will you integrate these teachings into your own life? Let's begin with metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. It is one of the most powerful psychological tools available to us, metacognition. When you become aware of your thoughts, your choices, and the patterns that drive you, you gain the ability to change them. Think of it like stepping backstage in your own mind. Instead of just playing the role, you suddenly see the script, the stage design, the lighting, all the elements that have been orchestrating the performance of your life without your conscious direction. And once you see it, you realize, I can rewrite this. Psychologists have studied this process in what's called cognitive reappraisal, the practice of reframing situations to change emotional and behavioral responses. When you become aware of the way you interpret experiences, you gain the ability to shift that interpretation. This applies to everything, from the way you handle setbacks to the way you define your personal motivations. Here's a practical example. If you've spent your whole life believing that working yourself to exhaustion is necessary for success, you can pause and ask, where did I learn this? Is this belief serving me? Do I actually want this to be a part of my why? And if not, what alternative perspective might be truer for me? One of the most powerful ways to reclaim your why is through what we call existential authorship, a term that refers to consciously choosing the meaning of your own life. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about this extensively, arguing that humans are not bound by inherent purpose, but instead must choose their own purpose. In other words, your why is not something you discover. It's something you create. This is a radical idea. It means that you are not obligated to carry the beliefs you were handed as a child. You are not required to keep motivations that no longer align with you. You are not permanently bound to the script that was written for you long ago. So how do you do this? How do you actively reshape your why? You start by questioning every assumption. For the next 24 hours, I want you to pay attention to your decisions, large and small. And before you act, pause and ask, why am I doing this? Is it out of obligation? Is it out of habit? Is it because you've conditioned yourself to believe that you should? Or is it because it aligns with your deeper values, your authentic self? This practice might seem small, but it is profound, because the more you ask this question, the more you begin to see the places where your motivations don't truly belong to you. And that's where the transformation begins. I'll share something personal. There was a time in my life when I realized that much of what I was pursuing wasn't actually for me. It was for the image I had of who I should be. That realization was both unsettling and liberating, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You either continue the pattern, knowing it's not yours, or you step into the discomfort of re-examining everything. And that discomfort, that's where real growth happens. So as we wrap up this discussion, I want to leave you with one final thought. Your why is yours to define. But if you don't define it, the world will define it for you. So take it back, choose it, own it, because once you do, you'll find that every decision, every action, every word, every thought becomes clearer, more intentional, and most importantly, yours. Your why is your power. So at the end of this exploration, here we are. We've unpacked the hidden influences that shape your why, the unconscious conditioning, the power of language, the illusion of choice, and the forces that pull your motivations in directions you may have never questioned. But the real question is, what do you do now? Because knowing this isn't enough. Awareness without action is just observation. Awareness without integration is just observation. And the purpose of understanding your why isn't simply to have a more refined sense of self. It's to reclaim your agency, to move through the world with a deeper level of clarity, to ensure that the choices you make belong to you and not to the scripts you inherited. The philosopher Seneca wrote, "Non scale sed vitae decimus." We learn not for school, but for life. Knowledge, true knowledge, is meant to be lived. And what we've explored today is not just an academic concept, it's a practice, a discipline, a way of seeing yourself with new eyes. So here's what I invite you to do. Start small. For the next day, pause before every major decision and ask yourself, is this truly mine? And be honest with yourself. If the answer is no, if you realize you are acting from obligation, from habit, from conditioning, pause. Consider another possibility. Ask yourself, if I were writing this script from scratch, how would I choose to act? Over time, these small moments of awareness will accumulate. And before you know it, you're no longer just reacting to life, you're creating it. Because when you own your why, no one can take it from you.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.